so far, an alien intelligence visits Earth in the distant past and manipulates the minds of ancestors. It takes the form of an enigmatic black monolith. Millions of years later, a monolith is discovered on the Moon. The black tombstone-like structure was progressively evolved from the glass pyramid in Clarke's short story The Sentinel. Once discovered, it sends a signal to Jupiter. How did they know where the signal was sent? Parabolic aerials, such as the ones on the USS Discovery, have a highly directional beam but leak radio waves. It is difficult to determine the direction without standing in front of the beam. However, thin radio beams can be made by overlapping slightly different radio signals. This is the fundamental principle behind the instrument landing system to guide planes to runways. The signal may have been composed of a similar pattern of amplitude-modulated waveforms, or perhaps a radio concentration gradient as a trail of breadcrumbs for the humans to follow. However, the easiest solution would be for the Jupiter monolith to send a return signal that could be precisely triangulated. The USS Discovery was dispatched to Jupiter to investigate.
I think also he transported the audience by his characters as well. Dave Bowman, you care for him. And I think the scene, of course, the famous scene that everybody remembers is when he dismantles Hal. And I don't think I drew breath in the cinema when I was watching that, because I was terrified that Dave would somehow be stopped and Hal would win, or Dave would die. But I think also what he managed to achieve was this incredible pacing. They had lots of time in space. Nothing was rushed, even the big dramatic moments when he goes outside the spacecraft to try and retrieve the body of his astronaut colleague, and it's taken at this glacial pace, but it's so riveting, it's so full of tension, and again, I think it's just the genius of a filmmaker, really, Stanley Kubrick.
Of all the film's spacecraft, the Discovery is the most sensibly designed and perhaps the most iconic of the film. It is powered by a larger version of the nuclear thermal propulsion system as used in the Ares 1B moon shuttle discussed in the previous program. With these engines, a heavy ship can reach Jupiter within a few months, rather than the 2 years it took the Voyager spacecraft, or the preposterous 6 years for the Galileo spacecraft via an Earth-Venus-Earth flyby. If the distance from the Sun to Earth is 1 astronomical unit, a 152 million kilometre distance, then Jupiter is more than 5 astronomical units. It is a little difficult to estimate how fast Discovery goes without more precise estimates of mass and engine efficiency. However, the book version states that the astronauts encounter an asteroid on day 86, and the journey time from Jupiter to Saturn was an impressive 167 days, 5.5 months. Clarke's back-of-the-envelope maths doesn't appear to quite add up here, but a reasonable estimate of the flight time would be about 6 months. The most likely orbit is a Hohmann-type trajectory. These are gentle elliptical pathways designed to intersect the circular-ish orbits of the planets. They use the least amount of fuel. To see why this works, it is useful to think of the gravitational gradient involved. Imagine a large curved funnel. Sitting at the centre is the Sun. The planet's masses make gravitational indentations on the steep hillside. Driving a small car directly up the slope is quite difficult. It's heavy and the engine doesn't have enough oomph to push it up the hill. However, a longer pathway with a lesser gradient is far more efficient. The engine needs to fire for a few hours to reach the correct velocity. This is something the film gets absolutely right, as the engines are never shown firing during the cruise phase. The angle of the light to the left or the aft of the port beam in nautical speak is absolutely correct for this type of orbit. Likewise, the speed of light is taken into consideration. Communications take several minutes to reach their destination. The television interview on BBC 12 is at pains to point out the time lag has been edited out. Originally, the Discovery was intended to fly past Jupiter and onwards towards Saturn. One can only imagine what Kubrick would have done had they managed to build a reliable model of Saturn's rings. A rough idea can be gleaned from the film's Silent Running, directed by 2001 visual effects director Douglas Trumbull. Inside the habitation module there was a slowly rotating centrifuge designed to simulate lunar gravity, along the lines of the artificial gravity of the space station in the previous episode. Early science fiction stories tended to regard weightlessness as a great health benefit. However, Clarke was absolutely correct in foreseeing this would cause problems. Decades of research has demonstrated that prolonged spaceflight causes osteoporosis, muscle atrophy, and immune system suppression. To film this scene, Kubrick built a gigantic studio rig that could rotate as Gary Lockwood ran round the bottom. A fixed camera running in a groove between the two halves provided the point of view. 3 members of the crew are in hibernation, their bodies cooled so that metabolic functions are suspended, or at least drastically slowed. The ostensible reason for this is to conserve resources on the outbound flight. We later discover the true reason. This is an extremely interesting idea and has been used as a staple for many a science fiction story, but would it actually work in practice? Maybe, but it would be extremely difficult to get it to work as intended. One idea that probably wouldn't work would be to freeze the person. Ice crystals expand as they get colder. They will rupture cells and generally destroy the microarchitecture of the body. Cooling the blood down to about 4 degrees may be of benefit. Types of open heart surgery and brain surgery can be greatly prolonged when the blood is cooled in circulation through a heart-lung machine. The idea is to slow down cell functions enough to make their stored oxygen and phosphates last the duration. A similar trick occurs in accidental immersion in very cold water. Many a patient has made a complete recovery despite being brain dead on EEG. However, there are several problems with this approach for any length of time. Blood is very unhappy when it is stationary. It has evolved to assume that it has leaked out if it isn't moving and tends to clot rapidly. Recovering after prolonged hibernation is most likely to cause a catastrophic thrombosis. A heart-lung style machine, perhaps with anticoagulants, might provide an answer, but this increases the number of metabolic processes needed, like bone marrow function to grow new cells, and increasing the likelihood that something will go horribly wrong with the equipment during the flight. Recent research into cold water immersion suggests the existence of a hibernation protein, although how this works practically is unclear at the moment. In the long run, it might be better to develop faster engines with more exotic methods of propulsion to allow travel to distant parts of the solar system in a few weeks rather than years. Ever the visionary, Clarke imagined a sentient, intelligent computer system controlling the spacecraft. As in many fields, computer technology advanced rapidly in the 1960s. Surely a clever AI was just around the corner. However, AI systems willfully ignoring instructions and doing bizarre things will seem all too familiar today. Clarke foresaw the problems of a program conflict. HAL 9000's core primary directive was to process information accurately without concealment. Yet he was programmed to lie about the mission's true purpose. Aware that his performance was being monitored by mission control, HAL attempted to sever the communications link by the AE35 antenna circuit. HAL lip-reads the astronaut's conversation about disconnecting his higher cognitive functions. He decides the only option is to eliminate the crew. In computer programming, this is a familiar problem usually based on a failure to understand how the user interface interacts with humans. A computer program encounters a novel situation and does exactly the opposite of what the system designers had anticipated. Stuck inside the pod, Dave is given the impossible option of jumping across the vacuum into the emergency airlock. HAL's gloating response suggests that the idea is ludicrous. From an acting perspective, Keir Dullia's performance is even more impressive since Kubrick had yet to record Douglas Rain's chilling voiceover for HAL. They would have instead heard the voice of Derek Cracknell, the first AD on the project, who would have said something along the lines of, "Well, without your space helmet, Dave, you're going to find that rather difficult, aren't you?" Would this actually work? In theory, yes. Decades of physiological research at high altitude have given us a rough idea of what might happen. Poorly written science fiction would have us believe that bodies will explode or freeze solid or something equally silly on exposure to vacuum. However, the 1 atmospheric pressure differential isn't really that great. As with scuba diving, as long as Dave breathes out during the jump, this should prevent any damage to the lungs. Likewise, the absence of convection and conduction leads only radiative heat loss, which tends to be fairly slow. Other than a few ice crystals in his tears and some bumps and bruises, Dave is unlikely to suffer any injury. The scene is played silently until the door handle is pulled. Again, absolutely correct, since sound isn't conducted through a vacuum. The only thing that is slightly amiss is the abrupt loss of pressure would cause the pod to tumble away slowly. However, this is an excusable error given the complexity of the rigging required to shoot the scene. What works well here? The handling of orbital trajectory and weightlessness is very well done. Kubrick invented most of the standard techniques of actor rigging and camera positioning and choreography. This is reflected in the meticulous and dramatic spacewalk and rescue sequence. In the third and final program, we discover whether Dave can flit between higher dimensions, whether consciousness can be stored as energy, and how Dave can go to infinity and beyond.